This is the final presentation in a series of 3 that I've put together on the early Irish myth and culture represented in the early medieval story tradition, the scéalta tradition in Ireland. Again, this is intended to be a very, very brief introduction, and it by no means is exhaustive at all. The whole purpose of this is to mark out some of the most prevalent topics and topics and concerns when it comes to the reading of early Irish tales, because a lot of times the early tales are quite difficult to engage with, quite difficult for us as modern readers to really understand what's going on. So hopefully after watching or listening to these 3 presentations, you'll have a better idea of what's going on when you read some of the really crazy stuff that goes on. Just like my other 2 presentations, I wanted to point out that we need to be very careful when reading these texts, that they are not identical with the historical reality. So when you see the kings and warriors doing their things, you can't look at it as a clear window onto the past. And we have to be very, very aware of what we bring to the stories ourselves, what expectations we bring to it. We have to understand our own ignorances and our own preconceptions that can affect how we interpret the text that we have. And of course, one of the big problems is that most people are going to be reading these in translation from the early forms of Irish, Old Irish, Middle Irish, Classical Gaelic, and they'll be reading them in an idiomatic modern English, which presents an enormous number of problems. So if you're really interested in this early storytelling tradition, you really need to learn the language as much as you possibly can. So in these 3 presentations, in the first one, I dealt with some of the context, some of the history, and the social structure represented in the tales. In the second presentation, I dealt with some of the religious aspects, so how the pre-Christian religious culture was represented in the tales, and then in this presentation, I'm going to deal with some of the cultural perspectives and the literary tropes that are reflected in those tales. And so you should see a lot of the ideas that I dealt with in the previous 2 presentations in this one. So if you haven't seen the other 2, you might want to go back and watch them. So cultural perspectives and practices. So what I'm going to really be dealing with here is oath-taking, the cult of heads, the divinity of fire, the force of poetry, Gessa, and sex. So first of all, oath-taking. As in early Norse culture and early Germanic culture, in most pre-modern societies, oath-taking is of enormous importance. And one of the things that we see coming out in the early literature is this phrase, "Tonga tonga the mahua." I swear by that by which my tua swears. It's sometimes translated as "I swear by the gods that my people swear by," or "I swear by that by which my people swear." It's translated in a number of different ways. It's, of course, much simpler in the Old Irish, "Tonga tonga the mahua." And what we see here is, on the one hand, a kind of a recognition of the relativity of oath-taking, that when you swear by something, everyone's going to have something else that's going to act as their guarantor. Aristotle talks about the Celts swearing by the sun and the moon, and what we see happening here is an unwillingness for the storytellers to say what it is by which those people are swearing, which indicates how important swearing was in the pre-Christian culture. But we see this again, "Tonga and tonga mahua," and it's always the same sort of formula. I swear by that by which my people swear that I'm the best warrior, that so-and-so did something wrong, that I will perform this feat. This is one of the basic tropes. So oath-taking is really, really important in this day and age, and it's of course connected back to that notion of truth that I talked about briefly in connection to the truth of kingship, the fear of flaheaven, that there's this kind of transcendent truth, what it means to be truly yourself, truly a king, truly a warrior. And if you don't stay true to that ideal, then it's going to lead to all sorts of horrible things happening. Death and destruction, expulsion from your position, loss of status in society. So what we see here is that it is connected to a person's firnia, a person's truth. And this is something that is much more than just a sense of telling the truth. You can kind of see it in English in the archaic use of troth, in the old archaic wedding vows. The phrase is used, "I plight my troth," and it's the same way that I bind my truth to this other person, to this thing, by the means of the wedding vow. So you can see a similar thing happening in Germanic cultures as well. So oath taking, very, very important. Another one of the more important and pervasive cultural perspectives and practices that we see in Celtic literature in general is the cult of heads. It's also one of the more difficult elements to pin down. They don't actually refer to the cult of heads. They don't talk about it. It's just something that they do. And it's something that we see going back right the way into some of the earliest Celtic periods. This is the Nouve Tarasque from France, down in the south of France, and you can see that this little beastie, dating back from the days of continental Celtic culture, actually has two severed heads underneath of his paws and what looks to be a dismembered arm jutting out of his chin. Don't really know what's up with that, but there it is. Severed heads show up in all kinds of places, and we know for a fact that they actually practiced this cult of the severed head, because in one of the Druidic temples from continental Celtic culture, there's a very famous post and lintel entrance to a temple where little alcoves were cut out and severed heads were placed. And when they dug this up, they actually found skulls placed in these things. References to the cult of the severed head goes all the way back at least to 500 BC, if not earlier. We have accounts that talk about various Celtic peoples tying them to their horses' manes, keeping them in bottles of water, and tying them to the lintels. And it comes as late as the 18th and even 19th centuries. In Scotland, this is the Well of the Heads. And this monument commemorates the resolution of a feud in which the seven betrayers of a certain clansman had their heads cut off, and it's referred to as the Well of the Heads. Now, the interesting thing about talking about the Well of the Heads connects heads to a well, obviously. But why should the resolution of a feud be connected to a well? Well, in this situation, there was a physical well there. But remember that I talked about before in the previous presentations how poetic knowledge, sovereignty was conceived as an alcohol brewed in the other world, that these were brewed in cauldrons. Well, in many cases, severed heads get associated with cauldrons. This is a silver phallera from the 1st century BC. And what we see here are 9 heads surrounding this sort of round thing in the middle. I would argue that this round thing in the middle is a stylized cauldron. And the reason why I say that is because in many cases, for example, in the story of Bran, the brother of Branwen, in the second story of the Mabinogion from Wales, we find what becomes the model for the black cauldron. It's a cauldron that comes up from underneath of a lake, being carried basically by a giant. And it has the singular property that if a dead body is placed inside, it will come back to life, unable to speak, which is basically saying that it's a zombie. To be unable to speak, and thus being unable to pronounce poetry, to enter into the social bond of dialogue, basically means that it's someone who's coming back without a soul. So it's basically really creepy. So the only way to destroy this cauldron was for someone to climb inside and break it apart from the inside, which somebody actually does. And the upshot of the battle is that Bran, this guy who actually takes part in the battle, winds up being mortally wounded. And he gives orders that when he's dead, his head should be cut off, and his head should be mounted up, and it will, so long as these certain requirements are met, his head will be just as good a companion at this feast as when he was alive. So the king and his ability to offer abundance, we can see being preserved with the severed head. So we have an association of feasting with the severed head, with the cauldron, and all the sort of stuff coming out in medieval lore. And so this notion of poetic mantic knowledge being brewed in this cauldron and then issuing out of the other world can be seen in parallel with the severed head, with poetry issuing out through the mouth. And there's a whole bunch of more stuff to this, but anyway, we'll go on there. So here's that beastie again, the Tarascon Nove, from about the end of the about 50 BC. Now that story of Bran the Blessed, what we can see happening there is the head of a wise king, and this is the big splash festival from Newport that actually sort of reenacted the severed head. He was a giant, Bran was. We can see that the severed head, ensures prosperity and protection. And so what Bran says is that, so long as the requirements for this feast are met, his head will be as good a company as when he was alive. And once the requirements are broken, basically when somebody opens a western door, his head will then ensure protection of the land so long as it's buried in a particular spot facing in a particular direction. And his spirit delays decay. The head doesn't actually decay. So what we see here with the severed head is that it acts as a kind of locus geni for the efficacy of the king to provide protection and abundance for his people. Now the interesting thing is that we have a slightly different version of this sort of a thing in Norse tradition, with the head of Mimir, who is a member of the Vanir, and Odin. They're one thing and another. Poor Mim gets his head cut off. So he is a member of the Vanir. Odin, of course, is the head of the Aesir, and they had a war. But when the war was over, the Vanir and the Aesir entered into an agreement together, and they basically dwelt together at the same time. They're one thing and another. Mimir gets his head cut off. And so Odin then uses his magical knowledge to preserve the head, and he places it down by the mouth of a well. And it's interesting that, we talk about the mouth of a well, again, with this head imagery and the fluid spilling forth from the lips. And Mim's head then becomes a font of wisdom, that the head, being preserved at the mouth of the well, can still advise. Mimir was the sort of lore keeper and the master of wisdom for the Vanir. So Odin then is he is capable of going down to this well where the head is positioned, and he can then partake of the wisdom that flows from the mouth of this severed head. So what we see happening here with the cult of heads is that the warrior culture keeps heads as trophies, but as such, it also represents the culmination of martial prowess. At the warrior's feats are manifestations of otherworldly knowledge akin to poetic inspiration. So remember that in the last presentation, I talked about how warriors were considered almost a member of this sort of artisanal class. So Cuchulainn, for example, is as much a poet as he is a warrior. And he is able to enter into a poetic competition with his sort of nemesis, Ferdiad. In poetic culture, heads are bridges to mantic knowledge. This notion of Odin consulting Mim's head, the idea of Bran's head being able to pass on his abundance and protection despite his death. And so they're all bound up with the king's ability, divine in its own way, to ensure the prosperity of his people. So severed heads, fantastically important, but you have to really get underneath the hood of these stories in order to see how this actually plays out and works. A lot of people, when they talk about the cult of severed heads, they just say, well, it's just trophies in battle. It's not just trophies in battle. There's a huge, enormously varied, complex system of symbols and tropes that are all bound up with this notion of the severed head. And it goes even much deeper than this, but this should give you an idea of the different ways that the cult of the heads will play into it. So another element in these cultural perspectives, another one of these cultural perspectives that I want to talk about is the divinity of fire. If you remember from the second presentation, fire was central cosmologically, that the fire was the center of the house And the fire of Beltane and Samhain these fires were central to the land at Ushnach. This is because fire itself is considered divine. Fire was considered a purative. So, for example, in Scotland, right the way down into the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, if your cattle were suffering from a disease, you would build what's called a need fire, where you would collect 9 different types of wood from uncrossed trees. That is to say, trees like the oak, the ash, but not trees like the hawthorn or the blackthorn. These are considered crossed woods. So you had to get the 9 proper types of wood. You had to use friction to start the fire, and once you had this going, you would create this bonfire and you would drive the cattle through it, and it would purify the cattle. Another practice from the same period, children would light a stick on fire and then swing it around their heads 3 times. This was considered protective. At Samhain, people would light jack-o'-lanterns, not the big pumpkins, but rather hollowed out turnips carved into, again, severed heads, put a fire inside the severed head, and then they would process around their property line 3 times with this fire held up in the air, and it was considered to protect the land. So fire itself had this purifying divine nature, and it goes beyond just the sort of physical protective. Cuchulainn, for example, when he goes out and first takes up arms as a young boy, he goes on his first foray and he kills just a load of people and takes their heads, their severed heads, brings them back. And we're told that he gets so hot from this that nobody can approach him. And as he's coming back to Evan Macha, the royal seat of the Olith, where Connachar MacNess is king, everyone's afraid that he's going to kill everybody. So they come up with a plan. They send 50 maidens out, and they all strip to the waist. They bare their breasts to him. And he gets so embarrassed that he hides his face. And they take that opportunity to rush up, grab him with tongs, and throw him into a vat of water. And he's so hot that the water instantly evaporates and the barrel explodes. So they grab him with the tongs and they throw him into a second one. Same thing happens, explodes. Grab him a third time, put him in the water, boils. And so he's cooled down enough. Now the interesting thing about this is that this is the same process that you do to metal, to a sword when you make it. You heat it up, it causes a chemical change to the metal, and then you temper it in the water, you quench it, and it hisses and bubbles, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. It's fire and water mixed together. But how do you get something this hot? What is it that fuels the fire? Well, if you know anything about building a fire, it's air. Fire has to have air in order to ignite. So if you've built a fire, you'll know that one of the quickest ways to get your fire to get hotter is you breathe into it. This is literally inspiratio, inspiration, the breathing in of something. The idea is that the gods breathe in to someone and their soul burns hotter and hotter and hotter. And so at the point when Cuchulainn is being crafted into the weapon that he will become, he is inspired by the gods. His soul heats up, causes the chemical change, and he has to be quenched in the water in order to become the Hound of Cuchulainn, the Cuchulainn. So what we see here is that fire is associated with the soul, associated with protection, associated with the transformation that occurs in Cuchulainn, and is also tied to inspiration, which of course is also tied to poetic inspiration. So the Divinity of Fire then also feeds Cuchulainn's poetic sensibilities as much as his martial prowess. We see it in a more direct way, this Divinity of Fire, when it comes to the story of Brigid. Now, Brigid, there's a historical Brigid and a mythological Brigid. Some people will say they're the same thing. The historical Brigid in the 5th century was a nun who was subsequently sainted. But because Brigid as a goddess was so important to the early Celts, many of the same stories and topoi that are associated with the goddess then map onto Saint Brigid as well. And one of these is the Divinity of Fire. Brigid was said to have had a sacred fire that only women could tend in her at her primary abbey, and on 2 occasions 2 ill-fated men decided to go in and blow on the fire. One went insane, the other one died. So there it is. So this brings me back to the force of poetry, and I talked a little bit about this before in the social structure. And the one thing about it is that the force of poetry controls reality. You see this coming out in weather, but it also comes out in physical attributes. And the where you see this happening most obviously is in the bardic tradition. And in the 16th century, the fairly well-known English poet Edmund Spenser criticizes Gaelic culture in Ireland because it says that the bards always lie. They flatter the kings. They describe them in preposterously false ways, all to get basically good payment out of them, and then incite them to go off and be rebels and horrible people. But this is misunderstanding the role of poetry in Gaelic society. You see, poetry was thought to have the ability to affect reality. One of the stories that's told about a bard is that when he satirized a king, when he declaimed a poem mocking a king, the king broke out in hives, basically broke out in blisters on his face. So we can see the affecting of reality at the time. If this is true in a negative way, it's also true in a positive way. So when a poet praises a king, it doesn't so much matter if it doesn't match what they look like right now. The idea is that the force of the poetry itself is going to make the king more worthy of that praise. Will actually make the king more beautiful if it's a true poet. And the force of poetry also is connected to the fertility of the land. So poetry really is a way to access the kind of source code of existence. It's like changing the code of the matrix through poetry. But poetry does more than this. It's more than just magic spells. It gives voice to divine insight, because the poet was considered to be able to look into the future, was considered able to access information that would otherwise be unattainable by normal means. In fact, one thing you can see this playing out in beyond Celtic culture. You see it playing out in Norse culture as well. Odin, who effectively is the god of poetry, his name means the twisted or contorted or really freaking scary guy. Oath, which is cognate with Anglo-Saxon woad, as in he waxed woad, he went crazy. Basically means it's the guy who's completely crazy. And the idea here is that when someone is party to otherworldly knowledge, they're going to seem like they're crazy. They're going to say things that don't make sense to people who don't have access to that knowledge. And the poet, as someone who, through his inspiration, is able to gain otherwise forbidden knowledge, also gains knowledge of the future. And as such also is able to answer riddles. So the poetry, through this sort of mantic function, is able to see past appearances. Poetry also forces dialogue, and you can see this in a number of different ways that I don't have time to get into. But in other words, if somebody pronounces part of a poem, somebody else is going to have to respond, and if they can't respond, dire things are afoot. And then finally, it embodies emotion. You can see this playing out in the literature in a number of different ways. One of the most significant examples of this is Ferdiad and Cuchulainn. After the battle is over, Cuchulainn has killed his foster brother Ferdiad, whom he loved very, very dearly, and he pronounces a poem that is giving voice to that grief. So just like today, it embodies emotion, but there's so much more going on. Gessa. Okay. A geis is a pronouncement of a condition, and if that condition is met, the person on whom the geis has been laid dies. So a geis is properly a taboo associated with death. Now this plays out in different ways, and if you look at the really early tradition, it seems to be a form of augury. In other words, the druid or the cleric or whoever is pronouncing the geis is actually kind of seeing what's going to come with the person's death, because everyone's going to die. So inevitably the geis is broken and the person's death is made certain. So it's possible that in its original practice in the prehistorical period that Gessa were a kind of precognition of what will cause someone's death. But eventually what happens is, over the course of the Middle Ages, you see Gessa being used instead as a kind of curse. And what we see this playing out in The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grania by Finn McCool. And the story goes that Finn McCool was supposed to marry Grania, the most beautiful woman in Ireland, who was also something like 20, 25 years his junior. And she didn't really want that, so she turned to one of his lieutenants, Diarmuid, and laid a geisha on him that he would have to run away with her, basically become her lover. He didn't want to do it, but because she laid a geisha on him, he said, okay, I have to do it or I'll die. So it becomes a kind of curse. But it seems like that early version of it seems to be more a prediction of how the person's death will come about. It's very important though, because Gessa are deeply tied to how society is bound together and the notion of the narrative of one's life. So it's very important to understand about Gessa. Sex. Okay. The Gaelic conception of sex is very different from our modern understanding of sex and how we think of it. At one point, Mav, the queen of the Connachta, she's trying to find people to go off and fight Cuchulainn because he's single-handedly stopped her entire army. And so finally she resorts to offering her daughter, Finnever, to anyone who will go and fight Cuchulainn. And at one point she even says, look, you can have my daughter and you can have me too. Which to us seems extraordinarily loose. And certainly that perspective would have been shared by Edmund Spencer again, who basically said that, the Gael are these, sex-crazed, hyper-violent lunatics who need to be brought into good English justice. The simple fact is that the Gaelic notions of sex were very, very different, and it's very difficult for us to sort of get a grasp on exactly what they were. But here's some examples. Marriage in Gaelic society had many different forms, and Cáin Lánavna, the law of the couples, as it is one of the Brehon laws about marriage, and it details up to 10 different types of marriage, all the way down from a forced marriage of a single night, which is rape, all the way up to marriage of an entire lifetime. In the early period, it was presumed that people would have multiple partners throughout their lives. Cuchulainn is said to have gone off and just had trysts with people all around Ireland, and it was just a matter of course. In one of the stories in Laura Gabal Heron, one of the princesses is walking along. She sees a guy come up out of the ocean, and they immediately have sex. And then she weeps because she says, I don't even know who your family is, and you don't know who my family is. And he says, look, it's okay, we'll take care of it. And he gives her a ring, and he says, look, this is the child, and this is how it should be raised, and all this kind of a business. And in another story about Cuchulainn, the three warriors, the three heroes, it's Cuchulainn, it's Leagre Buadach, and I think it is Conceit. Anyway, these three warriors are in a competition to see who is the greatest warrior in Ireland, and they go to see Mav. And when they get there, Mav says, okay, here's your allotment of girls to sleep with tonight. And so, now, again, caveat lector, this is not probably a reflection of a genuine practice during the time, but it does give you an idea as to their opinions about sex and notions of how sex work. We can see it playing out in certain religious ways too, because if you look at the Leafall here, the Leafall was said to have been brought from the northern cities of the world where the Tuatha Danann learned magic and sorcery, and it was said to have called out when the true king rode over it with his chariot. Now, the true king was said to have married the sovereignty goddess, and he did so in a very, very sexual way. And so the obvious phallic shape of the Leafall you can't separate it from the Leafall itself. It's part of it. And you can see a feminine iteration of that in the Sheila na gigs that you have all over Ireland and even over in Wales. And these are often posted up on door frames. Now, there's some there's some disagreement over the Schiellinic gigs because in Norman churches on the continent and in Britain, Norman churches often have a very similar figure to this as an embodiment of lust. And so it's sort of considered one of the cardinal sins. But a lot of times, the figure is shown with a man. And in Ireland and in Wales, it's very rare to see a man there. And there's some certain differences that suggest that something else is going on. So whether she is a symbol of some kind of mother goddess, as some people have argued, or she's an embodiment of lust, as other people argue, it's really up for debate. It's very difficult for us to get a hold on that. But if nothing else, it does show that perceptions of sex are different in the medieval Irish medieval Irish world. So that's really all I'm trying to say. So sex is one of those things that it's very, very prevalent, and you have to come at it with a very, very strongly open mind. You can't bring our modern moralities directly to bear on the medieval Irish tradition when it comes to sex. All right, so let's really quickly go through some literary tropes. First of all, prosometrum. One of the things that you see in the scale tradition almost without fail is that the story proceeds with a prose narrative interrupted by sometimes quite long poems. And the prose narrative almost always provides the context for the poem. Now, working with many students, I have found that we tend to, as modern readers, we tend to privilege the prose. The reverse was almost certainly true. The prose is only there to support the text. So prosometrum is the alternating of prose and poetry in the telling of a story. And in the early Irish tradition, what you're getting is a contextualization of the actual poems. The poems are the important things. The Watchman motif. I'm going to just really quickly go through this one. The Watchman motif is a riddling motif. And you see it coming up again and again where somebody looks out from usually a royal settlement and they see something strange. Usually it's a forest moving across the ocean, a mountain swimming across a lake, or something to that effect. And then they'll report what they're seeing, and then the other person who is graced with more insight will say, well, that wasn't a forest. You were saying the forest, which you thought were the trees, were actually the spears of an army. What you thought were crows flying above the trees were actually the clods of turf thrown up by their horses. And what you thought was, I don't know, something else. But you get the idea that it's a riddling motif. Somebody says, this is what I saw. It didn't make any sense. And someone else answers the riddle. So that's the Watchman motif. And it comes up again and again. Biblical resonances. This is something that a lot of people don't really get because increasingly people don't really know the Bible as well as people in the Middle Ages did. But anybody who's reading any of these stories or listening to any of these stories would have known the biblical stories, and they would have been able to tie them back. So biblical resonances show up again and again and again. Laura Gavala Heron again. The wandering of the Gael throughout the Mediterranean perfectly parallels the wandering of the tribes of Israel in the desert. So you always have to look out for biblical resonances. Descriptive tropes. You see this again, 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 and again. And the most common one is, her teeth were like a shower of pearls dropped into her mouth. Her cheeks looked like two apples. And the idea here is that these sort of stock phrases and stock descriptions are part of this tradition of poetic description that makes somebody more beautiful than they were. I'm not saying that that's exactly what they are in all situations, but these tropes of description come up again and again and again as part of the poetic landscape. Rhyme and alliteration. This is something you don't get so much in the translation, but you get rhyme and alliteration throughout. And of course, the whole point of rhyme and alliteration is harmony, resonance, and that's what poetry is all about. So the stories are poetic just as much as the full-blown poems are. The idea is that rhythm, rhyme, harmony, aural, notional harmony, these are all very, very important things. And as an example, I'll show you the introduction to one of the more famous early medieval poems, the Lament of the Old Woman of Bear, the Cailleach Vera. Now you can see here that it's preceded by this little story, and of course I don't have time to go into all the Irish, but the story goes that among the Corcadini, you have this old woman, and she is made a saint when she becomes when she has the kalyach, the sort of holy shawl placed upon her by a saint. Um, Saint Quimin was the guy that was supposed to have done this. And when she receives this veil, it changes her. Prior to that, she had gone through uh, alternating periods of old age and youth. She would marry a king and she would be regenerated. And she would then, the king would die. She would have had a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of children, and then she would marry a new king. She would be regenerated and go on. She's obviously a sovereignty goddess. That's the pattern that we're working with here. And in fact, the text even says, you know, Shacht neish neitid anyachid kajeged kach fer eg krinya uad. 7 periods of youth did she go through, so that each man passed away of death and old age. So she lost her husbands to death and old age through it. And then she's described as, where is it? She's described as having peoples and races, Kenela agus Tuaha, as her offspring. So she's one of these tutelary goddesses associated with tribes that's then married by the king and rejuvenated. But in this lament, she bewails the coming of old age. Alvadovsa beshmara. Ebb tide to me the custom of the sea. Alvadovsa beshmara shanta from Jeracroan, Turshaga kedo gnea, son of the tide alone. Old age has made me yellow, though it makes me weary, it comes to its food happily. And what you see happening here is that as she goes through this, she keeps coming back to this verb meleth, to grind, and what's happening is that there is a biblical resonance being called out. There's a passage in the Bible where the Lord God says to basically this figure of sovereignty, you know, sit you down and grind grain in the dust. For you will no longer be the daughter, you will no longer be the wife of kings. And so this is what's really happening. This is a poem really about the old pre-Christian religion and its Christianization and its being converted into something more appropriate. And of course, at the end of the poem, she says, I'm really, really sad because I'm so old and decrepit, but of course, I'm looking for this ultimate apotheosis where I will go and meet my true king and marry the true king and be properly regenerated at the second coming. So that completes our 3 presentations on an introduction to the early Irish scéalta tradition and some of the cultural issues that are involved with it. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll probably be making some more of these in the future.